All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are getting into the conversation surrounding why I tend to scrutinize Arthur Smith a lot more than most, and why I think it is important for him as well as the Falcons front office to overcome certain challenges for this team to rise up, not only this year, but into the future.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, putting up weekly content over at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons. And of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And before we get into today's topic, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify, as well as now free and available on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, give us that like over on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So today's episode is something I touched upon briefly on Wednesday's All 22 review, and we will spend the bulk of today talking about sort of why I tend to spend a lot of time and energy criticizing, scrutinizing Arthur Smith's play calling, probably a lot more than a lot of other people who tend to sort of dismiss the Falcons' ongoing problems as, a talent related issue or whatever the case may be. And talent certainly is a part of it, but a big part of it for me is, whether or not this Falcons are going to find themselves in a better situation in the future, to me, is going to heavily depend on Arthur Smith's ability to coach up the talent. And we will get further into why I think that on today's episode. But before we jump into that, I do want to give you a little bit of an update from the week of practice for the Falcons, in that we know that Deion Jones seemingly is back and healthy and going to play this week. And we'll sort of see how Deion Jones fares in this week 13 matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He didn't play particularly well to my eyes in that week 2 matchup against Tampa Bay. And that's part of the whole, thing I've been saying about Deion Jones for the last 3 or so years, which is he has a tendency to be very up and down. So we'll see if he's up or down on Sunday. And of course, we'll be back on Sunday to talk about it on the Rapid Reaction podcast. So there's nothing else I really have to add about this impending Week 13 matchup. As I said on yesterday's Crossover Thursday preview with Locked On Bucks co-host David Harrison, I don't expect the Falcons to win, but I am eager to see if this team is going to be a lot more competitive, which I think is going to stem potentially from better coaching, because we already know that the talent disparity is certainly in the Bucks' favor, and that is kind of the theme of today's episode. But before we continue that, I do want to thank many of you for not turning the comments on Wednesday's All 22 review episode, in which I was critical of Matt Ryan's performance against the Jacksonville Jaguars this past week, as sort of another ongoing battleground in the ongoing and perpetual and bloodthirsty civil war that Falcon fans have been raging over the last several years, but particularly more intensely over the last year or so, in regard to Matt Ryan. And, I would love for Locked On Falcons to be kind of a neutral zone, neutral ground in that civil war, and a place where we can really talk about football and not feel the need, as so many do, to wake up every day and pick a fight about Matt Ryan, which, for me, for the record, I think it's pretty silly, because at this point in time in Matt Ryan's career, in the year of our Lord 2021, you're not changing anybody's mind at this point in time. So it's just kind of a waste of breath. But to a certain extent, I do understand the sentiment, because certainly there was a stretch of weeks this summer where every day I woke up and had to wrestle with, am I going to pick a fight about, Julio Jones on Twitter today? But in my defense, the Julio Jones trade was still pretty fresh at that point, and relatively speaking, remains fresh in that regard. But the Matt Ryan debate has been raging on for well over a decade, almost 15 years at this point in time, well before he was a Falcon. I remember in this fall of 2007, debating and discussing with Falcon fans on various message boards that insisted that Matt Ryan wasn't a good quarterback prospect because he didn't play in the SEC. And I remember defending Matt Ryan, way back in like October of 2007. I basically spent the better part of the next decade defending Matt Ryan until he eventually won his MVP. And I felt like, oh, okay, I don't have to do this anymore. And now 5 years since then, part of me is somewhat impressed that you guys still have the energy to continually debate this subject. But, for me, instead of putting all my energy in trying to dunk on the haters or show up the cultists or whatever, I try to put my energy in deciphering what is the real issue that the Falcons face. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And, the team's so-called lack of talent around Matt Ryan is certainly a real problem. And rather than spending my time, saying that as a way to absolve Matt Ryan of any blame or any responsibility for the team's shortcomings, I look at that as a problem that needs to be fixed, that needs to be solved, and not just some talking point in, an ongoing narrative. And obviously, that's a problem that's only going to get solved by adding more talent, which, as I've explained before on the podcast, is not something that the Falcons are going to be able to do today or tomorrow. That's going to be something that they do several months from now, but it's not going to be something that they're going to be able to immediately solve with just, one off season of moves. That's going to take multiple off seasons in a long period of time. And, one of the other issues that I look at as a real problem is the team's coaching. Or rather, I look at that not necessarily as a problem, but really as a potential problem solver, because I believe Arthur Smith's improved play calling could go a long way to solving a lot of the problems that could potentially shorten the timeline that it takes for the Falcons to find the necessary talent to get back to a level where they are able to go up against a team on the caliber of the Bucs team that they're facing this weekend. And we feel like, yeah, from a talent standpoint, this is an even playing field. This is an even matchup. And instead of going into this game being, 11 and a half point underdogs, as they are on betonline.ag, maybe they're 1.5 point underdogs or something along those lines. And that's why I tend to be a little bit more critical of Arthur Smith, tend to scrutinize him a lot more than others do. And we'll further explore that on today's Locked On Falcons to see if Arthur Smith has the power to turn things around here in Atlanta. But you guys listen to a podcast for the power of knowledge, and you switch to Boost Mobile for the power of saving, because with Boost, you get the power of a free 5G phone so you can listen to all the latest episodes of Locked On Falcons, the power of 3 unlimited data lines for $30 a month per line so your family can harness all that brain power too, and the power of one of America's largest 5G networks so you can do it all at the speed of 5G. With all that money you'll save and all that knowledge you'll gain, just how powerful will you become? Switch to Boost Mobile and find out. Get a free Samsung A32 5G when you switch to one of America's largest 5G networks. More power to save. Boost Mobile. Free phone limited to new customers and one per line. Additional restrictions apply. Offers and coverage not available everywhere for all phones and networks. See boostmobile.com for details. So this holiday season, why don't you grab a protein bar that tastes just like a candy, or even better than a candy bar? If you don't know what I'm talking about Built Bars, the best tasting protein bar on the market. They're rich with decadent flavor, covered in chocolate, but they're healthy too. They're low in sugar and calories, carbs, low in fat, but high in protein and fiber. You get the best of both worlds. Delicious and healthy. So many flavors, you'll have a hard time choosing. You got raspberry, mint brownie, cherry, double chocolate, cookies and cream, peanut butter brownie, or my personal favorite, coconut almond. Built Bars give you the extra fuel to endure those endless shopping lines, battle those holiday shoppers for that next great deal, or maybe you can hook Santa up because I'm sure he's tired of milking cookies. But how about you leave him a Built Bar, since you know that he needs that fuel for the long night ahead of him. I'm sure Santa will love them so much he might even throw a few in your stockings. Just give him a heads up on your Christmas list. Check it twice. by heading over to built.com. Use the promo code locked15 for 15% off your order. That's locked15 for 15% off at built.com. So let's talk about Arthur Smith's role in this team's future. And obviously, as the head coach, he has a big responsibility there to get this team back to the winning ways. Of course, you also have Terry Fontenot as the general manager, assisting him in that role. But a critical role, a critical function of Arthur Smith is going to be serving as the team's offensive play caller, which is important because play calling is critical to success, because it's critical to offensive success, and offensive success is critical to team success. And play calling is not so critical to defensive success in my eyes. We're not going to get too deep into that on today's episodes, but just go with me for a moment and accept that it's not that critical for the sake of argument. But on offense, play calling is important, and Matt Ryan, of course, is going to be the Falcons quarterback for the foreseeable future. How long that foreseeable future lasts, I think it's going to be heavily dependent on how successful this Falcon team is, not only for the remainder of this season, but also next season. I'm very confident at this point that Matt Ryan will be the Falcons starting quarterback week 1 of 2022. But beyond that, remains up in the air. And I think a lot of that is heavily dependent on whether or not the Falcons finish and make the playoffs this year or next year, or finish with a winning record this year or next year. And we know that it's going to be difficult for them to achieve that if they don't have the talent to do so. And for the record, let's make my stance clear about the team's talent level. My stance is not that the Falcons have quote unquote superior talent, as some of the straw man arguments have been presented in the comments and elsewhere. The Falcons don't have the talent to match up with some of the top teams in the league, like Tampa Bay. I've never said that, but I think the issue for me is, like, I don't think their talent is so deficient that they can't be competitive on a weekly basis, like pretty much every other team or most teams in the NFL tend to be. We've seen the Falcons lose 3 games this year by 24 or more points, and that's as many as this team has had in by that margin, in the last 6 seasons combined. And if your response to that is basically, well, this year's team is the least talented of, the last 6 years, I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree. But for me, the lack of competitiveness, I think, stems not only from talent deficiencies, but the coaching not really getting more out of the current players. And I feel like that's the key when it comes to Arthur Smith. If the Falcons are going to be successful in the remaining time that Matt Ryan has in Atlanta, meaning that they're going to be a team that is a perennial playoff team, and a team that has a chance to win that elusive ring that I'm sure so many of you that are, particularly on that one side of the Matt Ryan Civil War, dream of him getting, not only because you obviously want the Falcons to win a Super Bowl, but hey, man, that's the ultimate thing that you can use to dunk on the Matt Ryan haters. Am I right? So if the Falcons are going to pull that off, not only are they're gonna have to add talent, but I think they're gonna need their coaching to elevate that talent. And on offense, that's really what it's all about. And I explained in a previous episode about how offense is closely linked to team success. When you look at teams that have made it to the conference championship game over the last decade, overwhelmingly teams do so with elite offenses rather than having elite defenses. And you can check that episode out on the card above here on YouTube. And that's not meant to say that defense doesn't matter, but if your goal is to be a top team and go toe to toe with a team like the Bucks in January, you got to be able to score a bunch of points. And there are 2 main ways to build an elite offense. And when I use the term elite, I use it as a way of basically saying that I can make a pretty compelling argument that that team, that entity, that player, that coach, whatever, is the best in the business at what they're asked to do. And so when it comes to building elite offense, you can do it either with elite play calling or elite talent, right? And you can obviously have both, but that becomes a lot harder to pull off. And for those of you that aren't watching on YouTube, this is part of the reason why you should subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, because you get a little bit of more of a visual style. But so you have elite play calling, and that can elevate lesser talent. And if you have elite talent, that can elevate lesser play calling. And when I say lesser, I don't mean like bad. I mean just like not elite. And so we've seen firsthand how when it comes to elite talent elevating lesser play calling, we've seen firsthand how that works with, Julio Jones over the last decade. It becomes a lot easier for teams and the Falcons' various play callers to scheme stuff up when you have a talent like Julio Jones. And the issue that Matt Ryan has dealt with over his career is that he's rarely had elite play calling. Outside of that one season in 2016, the Mike Mularkeys, the Dirk Cutters, the Steve Sarkisian haven't been necessarily a who's who of top-notch NFL play callers. They haven't been necessarily bad, but they haven't been the types of guys that can consistently elevate lesser talent week in and week out, season in and season out. And my concern right now with Arthur Smith is that he may not be on that Kyle Shanahan tier. But to be fair to Arthur Smith, as I mentioned in the episode last week, few thought at this point in Kyle Shanahan's first year in Atlanta that he was at that tier based off of the performance of the team that season, or that 2016 explosion was immediately on the horizon. So in the case of Arthur Smith, there is still time for him to turn it around. There is still time for him to prove me wrong in that regard. And again, I'm not calling Arthur Smith a bad play caller. I'm just saying his body of work thus far hasn't overwhelmingly impressed me, hasn't made me overwhelmingly confident that he's going to be pushing into that upper tier of play callers, that Ryan has rarely dealt with. And that's why you've seen over the last 13 plus years with Matt Ryan at the quarterback that the Falcons have instead invested a lot more resources in adding that so-called elite talent to elevate the play calling, whether we're talking about players like Julio Jones or Kyle Pitts, Roddy White, Tony Gonzalez, Michael Turner, the investments they made on the offensive line, because, they're trying to build a championship caliber offense around Matt Ryan, and they have to now target that elite talent because they're not getting it from their play call. And to be clear, this is not a unique situation to the Falcons or Matt Ryan. This is going to be the situation that the Falcons find themselves in when they move on from Matt Ryan, whenever that point is. This is true for all teams and all quarterbacks around the NFL. It just differs by degrees, depending on if you have Andy Reid versus Matt Nagy calling plays, or if you have Aaron Rodgers versus Blake Bortles, lining up under center. So it's just the different degrees that every team has to deal with. And, this becomes a central problem for the Falcons because they have to add that talent. And if the offense is going to turn itself around, Arthur Smith, you know, he has to show if he's not going to be the next Andy Reid or Kyle Shanahan or whoever, then the Falcons moving forward are going to have to expend the resources on adding that premium talent around Matt Ryan in order to maximize whatever the remaining years he has left. And you guys know, you've been quick to point out over the years that we've been putting too many resources in some of your opinions on the offense, and those are resources that are not going towards the defense. And every premium draft pick and every free agent dollar that the Falcons spend on the offense is a premium draft pick and a free agent dollar that does not go towards the defense. And you've heard me refer to this on previous episodes about that balance that the team has failed at achieving over the past 13 plus years with Matt Ryan at the helm. And it's not simply because their previous general managers and head coach were complete incompetent idiots. It was just simply, they weren't able to successfully execute that strategy of adding that talent and, on either side of the ball, because that balance was a little bit too out of whack. The players that they invested premium picks in on the defense didn't turn out well. And some of the players that they invested premium picks and free agent dollars on offense didn't turn out well. And so they always seemed to come up short, and that led ultimately for both the failure of the Mike Smith and Dan Quinn tenures. And hopefully that's a fate that Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot potentially can avoid, but they're going to have to strive to find that balance. And that's not easy to pull off. And I'm sure many of you guys are dying to see this team address many of the pressing needs that they have on defense. Because the talent dilemma, finding that balance on defense is a much more cut and dry than it is on offense. Because as I said earlier, defensive play calling, while it's not inconsequential, it's not unimportant, it's not nearly as impactful in my eyes as talent is when it comes to proving those top-notch units. And we know that because when we look at some of the great defensive minds over the last 20 years, whether we're talking about Bill Belichick or Dean Pease or Rex Ryan or Wade Phillips, Vic Fangio, Brandon Staley, Todd Bowles, they weren't necessarily having the success that they were having with just average talent. They would have premium corners like Darrell Revis and Jalen Ramsey and Aqib Talib and Asante Samuel, safeties like Eric Weddle and Ed Reed, Devin McCourty, Justin Simmons, linebackers like Roquan Smith, Navarro Bowman, Levante David, Devin White, CJ Mosley, Dante Hightower, pass rushers like Aaron Donald, Von Miller, Khalil Mack, Terrell Suggs. You got beef in the middle like Justin Smith, Vita Vea, Richard Seymour, JJ Watt, etc. And it's not about on defense, putting 11 all pros on the field by any means, because that's just nearly impossible. But you certainly have to have key elite difference makers at a number of different positions and different levels of the defense in order to build an elite unit on that side of the ball. And so that often requires you investing premium picks. And if you're investing premium picks, um, you know, and still needing to find those premium talents in the offense, that means you're going to have to invest mid-round picks in the offense and hope that they turn into some premium talents. And whether, again, whether you're investing those mid-round picks in the offense or defense, you're going to have to find day three gems like we've seen several teams, including the Falcons, find over the years with a player like Grady Jarrett. You got other defensive players like a Max Crosby. You got offensive stars like George Kittle and Dak Prescott, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Wyatt Teller, that were some day three gems for various teams over the years. Because if you're not being able to get that type of talent on day three, in addition to the premium talent that you're getting on days 1 and 2 of the draft, you're going to then have to rely on your coaching staff to elevate lesser talent. And as we said, that's harder to do on offense than defense. And again, that's why Arthur Smith gets a lot more scrutiny for me, because it's his responsibility to really elevate that talent on offense that the Falcons, as you guys often mention, don't necessarily have. And the odds aren't necessarily in the favor of the Falcons coaching staff or their front office, given that they face a number of challenges to build a consistent winner. And we'll continue to explore some of those challenges here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. But speaking of odds being in your favor, BetOnline has all your odds covered this season. They got props, lines like never before as the football season continues its march towards the playoffs. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the sports action this season, from football, basketball, NHL, boxing, UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. Head to the new updated desktop or mobile site and sign up today. Use the promo code Locked On and you'll receive a 50% welcome bonus with your first deposit. Don't wait. Take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline, where the game starts. So let's put on our profit hat for a second, right? And, I know while you guys will sit here for the rest of this season and blame every poor performance of Matt Ryan and on the lack of talent on the offense, and every poor performance of the team on offense on the lack of talent moving forward, I'm betting that when we get to January, the divine vision is telling me that in January and February, that once you guys start obsessing about various mock drafts, when you start to see that mock draft that has the Falcons taking a non-defensive player in round 1, you're probably going to flip out and rant about it on Twitter and talk about how it's crazy, which to me personally is a little hypocritical that you're going to blame all the Falcons problems offensively on not having enough talent. But when the Falcons, at least in a random person's projection on what they might do as one possible scenario for the draft, suggests that they address that talent deficiency with an offensive player, you don't want to have anything to do with it. So I'm looking forward to that when we start up mock draft Mondays here on Locked On Falcons at some point in February. But let's, for the moment, present a hypothetical situation where we are all very much in agreement with those people that will be ranting about these mock drafts, that we need to finally give Matt Ryan a defense. Which I'm sure most of you listening to and watching me right now, are on, that team. And I think have every right to be on that team. Certainly given the, frustration that the Falcons defenses have caused for the better part of the last 10 to 15 years. So, we're going to insist on using our premium, assets early in the draft on that side of the ball. And that means that we're not going to be able to use those premium assets on the offensive side of the ball. So, at least in the draft, and again, free agency is also a factor in this, but we're not going to dive too deep into that and how that plays a part into it. They're going to have to wait until the middle to later rounds to address some of their needs on offense. And as I said earlier, unless Terry Fontenot can do an outstanding job in finding some real gems there in the late rounds, the Stephon Diggs types of players don't necessarily grow on trees. It's going to be tough sledding for the Falcons, but we do know that certain positions, particularly several key skill position spots on the offense, like running back, wide receiver, and tight end, do have a long history of players or of teams hitting on players on day three of the draft. So that does give us some hope and optimism that Terry Fontenot could pull it off with that sort of strategy. But the point is, I want to stress that unless Terry Fontenot can really have some historic draft runs over the next year or so, they're probably not going to be working with a ton of premium mid-round talents. And thus it's going to be, again, shifting back to the Arthur Smith to see if he can elevate the talent. And, when you look at it, players like Mike Davis, Wayne Gallman were fourth round picks. And they represent, relatively speaking, when you go back over the last decade, the upper tier of running backs taken in that round in terms of their current NFL success. And certainly there are better fourth round running backs that have been taken over the last decade, including Atlanta's own Devontae Freeman. Marlon Mack is another good example. But the point is, if Arthur Smith can't get more production out of the Wayne Gallman and Mike Davis types, established players from that, tier of talent at the running back position, is his job going to be a lot easier to get more talent out of a greener rookie than either one of those guys? You look at the wide receiver position, you look at Russell Gage and Tajay Sharp, Olamide Zaccheaus, all clearly day three talents. Zaccheaus was not selected on day three, but was an undrafted free agent a lot of people thought was going to be selected on day three. But if you're not going to get more out of those guys, you kind of are pinning all your hopes on finding the next Stephon Diggs, the next Tyreek Hill, the next Marvin Jones, the next Antonio Brown. Is that player going to walk through that door and bolster your talent at the wide receiver position? Then you go to the tight end position. Hayden Hurst was a first round pick, but was a third round talent to my eyes, and based off of his career has performed at the typical level that you see from third and fourth round tight ends, over the years. And if you're not necessarily knowing how to use that guy and make him into an effective and reliable, number two tight end, what are the odds that some other mid-round rookie tight end is going to fare better? And we can play the same game with the mid-round talents that the Falcons have starting on their offensive line with Caleb McGarry, Matt Hennessy, and Jalen Mayfield. And again, I'm not saying all this to paint this sort of doom and gloom portrait. I'm just trying to show you guys that this situation for the Falcons is not an easy one to overcome. Nor am I trying to sit here and say Arthur Smith is a bad coach or a bad play caller. As I've said several times, we don't really know what Arthur Smith is right now, but it doesn't mean just because we don't know that definitively that he should get a free pass when it comes to scrutinizing him. And, part of that is, why aren't we spending more time talking about Calvin Ridley's disappearance in this offense? And no, I'm not talking about the mental health break that he is currently taking. I'm talking about, why didn't the 2020 version of Calvin Ridley show up this year? The last time we saw a player resembling that was in that first scrimmage against the Miami Dolphins in August, and we haven't seen that player ever since. And again, I'm putting on my prophet hat for the second time today. But my third eye is open, and it's telling me, at the end of the season, when we look back at why Calvin Ridley's the production declined, a lot of it is going to be, to me, the low hanging fruit, which is going to be, oh, well, it's related to his mental health struggles. And again, I don't know enough about what's going on with Calvin Ridley off the field to assume anything one way or the other, or to say, the mental health stuff has nothing to do with it. But what I do know is that when I watched the film and seen what Calvin Ridley was doing on the field when he was playing, part of the decline was how Arthur Smith changed how he was used from what we saw a year ago, by running a lot fewer of the routes that Calvin Ridley was known to shine running. And we saw Calvin Ridley's production, not coincidentally, tank. In the 5 games that Calvin Ridley's played in 2021, he's averaged about 6 catches for 56 yards, 9 yards per reception. and no, that decline is not related to not having Julio Jones, because we saw in the 8 games or 32 quarters, which is the equivalent of 8 games that Julio Jones missed last season, Calvin Ridley was averaging 77 catches for 99 yards per game with, a yards per reception of 15. Over the final 4 games of the 2020 season with Julio Jones out of the lineup, Calvin Ridley was averaging 117 yards per game. Was it mental health that was causing Calvin Ridley to just run nothing but digs and crossers for the first month of the season, as opposed to the comebacks and corners and timing-based routes that he was killing teams like the Bucs at the end of last season with? And that leads to, for me, for a lot of the questions on whether or not some of the concerns surrounding this Falcons wide receiver core, how much of it is a lack of talent and how much of it is maybe this offense isn't really doing a great job utilizing what talent the Falcons have, that this offense isn't really great at utilizing receivers that aren't big physical specimens like a Kyle Pitts or like an AJ Brown. So when Matt Ryan struggles in the future, or if Matt Ryan struggles in the futures, as you guys insisted on Wednesday, on at least on Twitter, and again, shout out to you guys in the comments for not going there. But you're gonna pin that on the fact that the Falcons wide receivers aren't getting open, and then I'm gonna ask you, okay, if that's the case, and again, that wasn't the case on Sunday against Jacksonville, but if that's the case, why aren't they getting open? And then you're probably going to respond, well, they just don't have the talent to get open. And I'm going to sit there and go, are you sure about that? You sure about that? That's why? You sure about that? Because I'll just say, like, every day you wake up thinking, we got to fight about Matt Ryan, or hate on Matt Ryan, or overhype Matt Ryan, or whatever the thing that you guys are fighting about. These are the things I sit up every day thinking about. And I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, but at least to me, that is a much more interesting and compelling conversation to have about it. And sort of, these are the topics of conversations that we'll continue to discuss on this podcast now and into the future. Because, to me, this is the real issue that the team is going to have to deal with in the coming years. And again, this is not meant to be a takedown on Arthur Smith. This is not meant to be doom or gloom. This is not meant to say that it's all going to come crashing down for the Falcons. It's just sitting here saying, like, these are real obstacles that this team is going to have to overcome in the present and in the future. And, again, instead of spending all your time arguing about Matt Ryan, if I can get up on my soapbox once more, and saying he's not the problem, okay, then what is the problem? What is the problem, guys? And again, I don't think the problem is Matt Ryan, but the problem may be that the team has a finite number of resources, whether they be draft picks, whether they be cap space, and those resources may not be enough to uplift this team and the talent of this team to a level that it needs to be, if they don't get a lot more help from this coaching staff uplifting that talent based off of their play calling. And they may find themselves in a situation that the only way that they will get the necessary resources that they can in order to add that level of talent that they need may be selling off what little talent, allegedly, that they already have, which includes players like Grady Jarrett, Deion Jones, Calvin Ridley, and yes, Matt Ryan. So again, this is not really me trying to be doom and gloom, but this is kind of a real dark cloud that is kind of hanging over this organization, that we're looking at those storm clouds, on the horizon, and we're wondering, or at least we should be wondering, is this team on the cusp of just completely nuking this team and tearing it down and starting all over? Similar to what we were, back in 2007, the last time we had multiple 24-point, deficit blowout losses. And so to me, the only thing that's going to stop that from happening, sooner rather than later, is if Arthur Smith and his coaching staff and Terry Fontenot in this front office do an exceptional job coaching up what talent they have, and or finding talent in places that typically is hard to find talent, including later in the draft. So if I'm being honest with you guys, based off of the first 10 months that those guys have been on the job, I haven't been that impressed by Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith. They may wind up figuring out all in the end. And as I've said, for the last 6 months, because of that, I'm fascinated by what they're going to do this upcoming season. I'm waiting to be impressed. And for, I'm sure, a lot of you, it sounds like negativity, and if that's what you want to label it as, then so be it. I can't fight that anymore. I would call it impatience. I would call it probably me being old and jaded and cynical. given that, I've been a longtime Falcon fan for 3 decades, and I'm basically just waiting. Okay, when are we going to be good again? Now, and yes, I am impatient about that because I've been waiting 3 decades for it. And for me, the clock is ticking. And I know we're tired of having this conversation, but it goes back to the decision made at the top of this past year's draft. You know, taking Kyle Pitts over a quarterback. And if they had taken a quarterback, while it wouldn't have shortened the timeline, it probably would have caused people like myself. I can only speak for myself, but I'm sure many of you to understand. Oh, this is going to be like a 4 or 5 year project because that's typically how long it takes for quarterbacks to be good. And so there in that situation, I couldn't help but have patience. But with the choice of taking Kyle Pitts, it at least seemingly puts them on the path of like, no, this is not going to be a 4 or 5 year rebuild. This is more of a win now situation that's going to last 2 or 3 years. And for the record, I don't think the team is really in that sort of win now mode. I just think their plan may wind up being a 4 or 5 year rebuild, but in that time, in the next 2 or 3 years, they're just really expecting Matt Ryan to kind of tread water with this team before they make that switch to a younger quarterback. And then, they'll have the resources after several off seasons and then potentially the cap space to add the necessary resources where they can be, a top-notch team. And the timeline on when that switch occurs is up in the air, and a lot of that is dependent on sort of their short-term success and how, whether or not they win. The more successful they are this year and next year, the longer that timeline gets extended, the longer Matt Ryan has to tread water. If that's the case, it's the difference of, are we replacing Matt Ryan within 1 or 2 years, or are we replacing him within 3, 4, or possibly 5 years? And that's dependent on how many, how effective this team is at winning games. And we're going to be having this conversation forever and ever. It's not going away. It's the same conversation, when it comes to Arthur Smith and Matt Ryan and all these various things. It's the same conversation we brought up earlier this offseason when the Chargers made the choice to stick with Phillip Rivers. Anthony Lynn, first-time head coach. I'm riding with Phillip Rivers. That lasted a couple of years. Didn't work out for them. They wound up the next time they were picking in the top 10. They were taking Justin Herbert, but that didn't work out, great for the next coach, Brandon Staley, because he gets to work with Justin Herbert. That's not going to work out for Anthony Lynn. And that's the fate that you don't want to see Arthur Smith have and fall under. So again, a lot of it is going to rest on his shoulders to be able to do the thing that Anthony Lynn couldn't do, and uplift that team and make them into a consistent winner year in and year out. And a lot of it depends on the talent they add and the coaching and the play call. And again, all the things I've pointed out in today. And so, I think too many people out here think that where you fall in that whole, Pitts versus Fields versus Mac Jones, if you want to throw him into that conversation, is dependent on what your opinion was or is on Matt Ryan. And frankly, like, I think your opinion on Matt Ryan has nothing to do with where you fell in that, because to me, if you really understood what was going on with the team, you don't need to have a positive or negative opinion towards Matt Ryan to understand those circumstances. So, that's how I think, we should proceed. But obviously I welcome your feedback and whether or not you think this is a bigger issue, whether you just want to take it back to Matt Ryan, or you want to hate on me for, still being a fan of Julio Jones. Whatever you want to do, of course, I welcome your feedback. Of course, you can do so on Twitter at Locked On Falcons, on Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Of course, you can also leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And of course, guys, while I appreciate you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day, I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And that's, of course, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, all free and available on the same podcast platforms that Locked On Falcons is available, and as well as Locked On Bets. If you want to know, find some extra money for this holiday shopping season, the season of giving, and you want to give yourself a little bit more money, Locked On Bets is the perfect daily podcast for you, where handicapping expert Lee Sterling is giving you his lock of the day, his blowout specials, as well as his daily picks. So check out Locked On Bets again on all the same podcast platforms. Guys, will be back on Sunday with a rapid reaction to whatever happens in this Tampa Bay Bucs game. Hopefully, the Falcons will be competitive and we can start looking, okay, like, Arthur Smith's doing his thing, like that's what I want to be talking about on Sunday. I want to be praising Arthur Smith. He's listening to the podcast, and he's like, "I'll prove you wrong, Aaron." I'm like, "Hey, man, I'm all for it, guys. I'm all for it. I want to be impressed. I want to be proven wrong." The old saying I used to have on a former podcast I used to do was like, if I'm wrong, that usually means good things are happening for the Falcons, right? Just because of the pessimism and the negativity, as they say. So we'll see what happens, guys. That will do it for us on this week of the Locked On Falcons podcast. And of course, we'll be back on Sunday with a rapid reaction to this week 13 action between the Falcons and Bucs. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.